Okay, so I'm going to talk about managing Jenkins with Jenkins, how we use Jenkins' system Groovy Scripts feature to automate the management and monitoring of our Jenkins infrastructure. We have a pretty large Jenkins setup at Netflix. We've got about 3,200 active jobs on our main Jenkins master. They take up about 3 terabytes of build data. We actually have multiple masters now as well. We're starting to shard jobs off between multiple masters for reliability and stability purposes and for speed. We've got about 100 build slaves. And one key aspect of Netflix, which Justin from Netflix alluded to earlier in his job DSL talk, is that we let any developer configure and run jobs. So, as you can probably imagine at this scale, we have to automate the management of the infrastructure. We have to make sure certain conventions are met by all the jobs just to stop things getting too out of control. We have to stop disk space getting too out of control from all those builds. We have to make sure all the slaves stay up and running in the master. So how can we automate all these things? There are multiple ways to do that within Jenkins. There's the remote APIs, the REST API. That's a really, really nice interface for querying what Jenkins is doing, but it doesn't have a huge amount of functionality for updating things. So that's not really a suitable option for us. There's the Jenkins CLI, which is also very nice and comprehensive. That's got a few more kind of monitoring and control commands which you can use to control your Jenkins instance, but it still can go quite far enough for what we want to do with managing and monitoring and automating. And of course, the ultimate way to control Jenkins is to write your own plugin, but that's pretty heavyweight. It's quite a learning curve, and it's pretty complex to maintain. And we have a lot of needs that are pretty custom to us and wouldn't really make it worth releasing a plugin to the general community. So the best option we found is a particular type of build step called the system Groovy script. These give you full access to the Jenkins master's JVM and all its object model, just like a plugin would. But the amount of code you have to write is much less, and it's much easier to maintain. Because you're running within a Jenkins job, you can make full use of Jenkins job scheduling. You can record all your build results, so you know the history of when a particular script ran. You can use all the logging. You can use notification to tell people about the results of running the script. And you can even use data visualization, such as the plot plugin, if you want to do something like count the number of failed builds in the last hour and plot that over time. That's pretty easy to do. All you need to get System Groovy Scripts going is to install the Jenkins Groovy plugin. That gives you the System Groovy build steps, plus a script console where you can write scripts and test them out within the Jenkins JVM with full access to the data model. Let's look at a couple of examples of what we use this for at Netflix. We automatically disable any job that hasn't built successfully in the last 90 days, just to stop the system getting too cluttered and running jobs that are going to fail needlessly. We can relabel a group of build slaves. That's useful if we want to change the configuration of a set of slaves, for instance, and bring up a new set of instances. We can do that very easily by unlabeling the old slaves so that they start running builds. Spin up a set of new slaves, let those start taking builds, and then wait for builds to drain off the old slaves and just shut them down. We monitor slave uptime for various teams. Various teams at Netflix have their own custom pools of slaves, and we give them a facility where they can monitor whether those slaves are up, and they get notified if a slave gets disconnected. They can go investigate it. For our standard slave pools, we've actually got self-healing scripts set up where we will check the connection status of the slaves. We can often get into a state where the slave thinks it's connected in Jenkins, but it's got a remoting error that stops builds from succeeding on that slave. So what we do in that case is just to disconnect the slave and bring up a new one before any subsequent builds fail on that slave. We automatically set the number of builds to keep for new jobs. If that's not set, then it will keep an unlimited number of builds, and that can get disk space get out of control pretty quickly on the master. And we can also check build labels so that any unlabeled builds, which might just end up on a random slave, you know, a Linux build ending up on a Windows slave, for instance, we make sure that the standard labels are set up so that the builds end up in the right place. So how to figure out where to get started with writing system Groovy scripts. It's a little tricky maybe, but there are plenty of resources to help you out. There are actually a bunch of sample scripts out there. There's a plugin called the Scriptler plugin, which gives you access to a hosted repository of scripts that you can upload into your own Jenkins instance. Or there's also a GitHub repo with a set of sample scripts. Some of our Netflix scripts that I mentioned earlier are already up there on Scriptler and on GitHub, and I'll make sure the rest of them are up within the next day or two. As I mentioned before, the Groovy plugin gives you a script console where you can test out your system Groovy scripts. Be pretty careful with that. It's easy to make mistakes. I'll describe that a little bit in a couple of slides' time. The Jenkins API Java doc obviously gives you the full description of all the classes and methods and properties within Jenkins. It can be a little hard to get started with that and to know where to look, what class you're looking at. So one thing that we find really useful is a little object inspector method that we wrote in Groovy that you can incorporate into your scripts. And that looks like this. It basically gives you, given an object in Jenkins, it'll show you the type and all of its methods and all of its properties. As I mentioned before, be very careful about testing system Groovy scripts. You often want to do something like loop over all the jobs or all the builds or all the slaves on your system and change them in some way. And if you don't do that carefully in an isolated instance, you can really mess up your Jenkins master. I did that myself once by accidentally launching every single job that was defined on the Jenkins master. Luckily, I found a nice plugin that somebody wrote. If you're here, thanks very much. It just empties the build queue in Jenkins by the press of a button, so that saved me. Here's another job that we keep around just for cautionary purposes. This one accidentally disabled every job on the system, and it was a little tricky to figure out which ones were already disabled before we ran it and re-enable them, but we managed to figure it out in not too long. Couple of tips for developing system Groovy scripts. As I mentioned just now, always use your local Jenkins instance to develop on. It's very easy to do that just by running the command there. And it's also very easy to set up some dummy jobs and slaves that you can load up just from files or with a couple of easy CLI commands. For small scripts, you can usually get away with using the script console or just putting the code in line in the job configuration. For larger scripts, I much prefer to use a code editor or an IDE that gives you code completion and syntax checking. It's really easy to miss out a brace or something if you just type in the Groovy directly into the job config. And another tip that I like to use is always make sure that your script is in source control when you're done with it so that you can track changes to it and it's backed up outside of Jenkins. So here's where to get the stuff, just to repeat the URLs, either the Scriptler repository or the GitHub repo with the sample scripts. These slides I think will all be online, by the way, for people taking photos, and I'll make sure they're on SlideShare as well, and tweet that out with the JenkinsConf hashtag. Big thanks to all our sponsors. Awesome Jenkins conference again. And here's how to get a hold of me. Just one quick mention that We are hiring at Netflix, and if you want to work on Jenkins full-time, come and find somebody in a Netflix clothing. There's about 5 of us here today, I think. And with that, thanks very much for listening.